This is The Comics Alternative, episode 253. Reviews of Lighter Than My Shadow, Now, number 1, and The Family Trade, number 1. Hello and welcome to another episode of The Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I'm Paul, and we're two academics talking about comics.
And this week, Paul and I are going to be discussing three very interesting works. We're going to begin with Lighter Than My Shadow by Katie Green. After that, we're going to look at the first issue of the new Fantagraphics anthology, Now, and that's edited by Eric Reynolds. And then after that, we're going to look at issue number 1 of Justin Jordan, Nikki Ryan, and Morgan Beam's The Family Trade. But before we get into that discussion, we want to let all of you know that this episode of The Comics Alternative is brought to you by those wonderful folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off of the cover price. Sometimes 50% off of the cover. But every now and again, you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that.
Yeah, for example, the books that we're talking about today, you can find Lighter Than My Shadow on DCBS for 30% off the cover price. And,
Yow!
Yeah, that's right. It's fantastic. Also, upcoming issues of the other series that we're talking about, Family Trade number 3 is there now for 40% off the cover price. And Fantagraphics Now, the next issue, isn't out yet, isn't yet on DCBS, but it will be, I'm sure of it, and I'm sure it'll be there for a significant discount. Listeners will also know that we always like to talk about the monthly bundles that DCBS features, and you're going to find Marvel, Valiant, DC, Vertigo, Young Animal, all kinds of great publishers in bundles for 35, 40, 50% off at Discount Comic Book Service, so you got to check those out.
That's right. They have so many specials that when you look at the website, your head will explode. But in a good way. So that's Discount Comic Book Service. Their website is dcbservice.com. Go there for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
That's right.
So, Paul, how are things been going with you?
I'm doing well in the swing of the school year, and enjoying the weather so far. Although I'm here in Northern California, and so we've had a fair bit of smoke, and definitely our hearts go out to folks in the North Bay area where the wildfires have been ravaging homes, and it's been tough to see that. But personally, I'm doing well. Yeah,
I've wondered how you may be faring or how you may be affected by the various fires that are out there.
We are far enough away. I live in the East Bay, near Oakland, and we're far enough away that we're not worried about evacuation, although friends and family members have been dealing with that. It's really the smoke that comes sort of downwind toward us that, we in schools where I work, kids are staying inside for PE and lunchtime and things like that. But, one of the things that was a news item, obviously their lives lost and things like that, is the home of Charles and Jeannie Schultz was burned down. And there's a Schultz Museum there in Santa Rosa that I think is okay, but just so sad to hear about Charles Schultz's home where he lived for decades. No longer there. So that's tragic. Although I know that Jeannie, his widow, is doing okay.
Yeah, and in fact, I just recently learned that a comics creator that we've discussed before on the podcast, on the webcomics episode, Brian Fries, his house burned down. And
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, and in fact, Sean Kleefeld, my co-host for the webcomics monthly series, alerted me to this. And what we're going to do in November is we're going to discuss a very recent webcomic that he created about that experience of being burned out.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So, our hearts go out to those who have been affected, and we're sorry to hear that. If nothing else, we hope that maybe listening to the Comics Alternative can be a momentary reprieve. But take care of yourselves out there, Californians.
That's right, definitely. And, people all over the country and the world who are struggling and suffering. But hey, talking about comics, hopefully, like you said, Derek, is a little bit of an escape. And we enjoy providing that for you.
Well, speaking of escape, let's begin our little escape romp by discussing the first book for the week, and this is Lighter Than My Shadow, written and drawn by Katie Green. This is coming out from Lion Forge, and it was released last week, in fact, October 3rd. This is a memoir about Katie's struggles with anorexia, and other matters as well, which we can get into. This is a book that I have seen publicized or solicited for quite a while, and I was wondering when it was going to come out. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, that this was published a few years ago by the publisher Graphic Medicine. Is that correct?
Yes. I'm not sure about the publisher, but I do know that it was published prior and is republished now by Lion Forge.
Yeah, I think it was Graphic Medicine, and it could be that that's where I saw the book listed previously. But now we just have it recently out from Lion Forge, and it's a hefty tome.
It sure is. It's in the area of 500 pages, and the physical book is a weight to carry, but I think that corresponds with some of the heaviness of the themes. Indeed, we talked about it being escape, and I think in this this book, I wouldn't say is so much an escape as a confrontation with a really challenging set of obstacles that Katie Green is just so vulnerable and so honest about that it really does hit you. And I was tremendously moved as I read the book.
Right. And, I do want to talk in a moment about the physicality of this text, because I don't yet have a physical copy of Lighter Than My Shadow. I was reading from a review PDF that the publisher kindly sent us. So I'd like to discuss your experiences reading the physical copy, and then we can compare and contrast that to my experiences reading the PDF, because there are a few problems here or there. But first, let's talk a little bit about what goes on in Lighter Than My Shadow. As we mentioned, this is a graphic memoir about Katie Green's experience growing up with anorexia, but it's more than just anorexia that's a problem for her. She's obsessive-compulsive. That feeds into her anorexia. And in fact, when we see her as a little girl, and it does cover her, I guess, a broad span of her life. We first see her as a little girl, and then the narrative ends around the time that she's in art school. And we do see a grown Katie Green, I think toward the beginning, who is writing her own memoir. So I don't want to say that it's metafictional in that way, but we do see the grown Katie Green who is writing her own story, which covers, a broad span of her life.
Yeah.
So we see the younger Katie, obsessive compulsive about a number of things, especially when it comes to eating. And this obsessive compulsive behavior feeds into eventually her problem with anorexia. But then in terms of treating the anorexia, we see her going to a series of doctors and therapists. There's one therapist in particular, and we can spend, I think, quite a bit of time discussing him, the guy Jake, the unconventional therapist. who seems to be helpful in getting her, if not cured, then at least able to deal with her problems. But then that, her experiences and her relationship with Jake turns sour and causes a whole other set of problems and that she has to overcome. And this is physical abuse. Basically, Jake takes advantage of her. And again,
sexual abuse.
And this is something we can eventually get to, because Jake is an interesting figure, not only because of what he does in terms of the abuse, but because of how he lives with his family and where he's located. In a teepee in the outdoors. So that's a little unconventional, but. But in a nutshell, I mean, that's what Lighter Than My Shadow is about. It's about Katie Green's attempt to come to grips with her anorexia, her obsessive compulsiveness, and her experiences being sexually abused by Jake. So there's a lot packed into this graphic memoir. You were telling me before we turned on the microphone that your reading experience with this physical 500 plus page text is probably different from mine reading the PDF. What were you thinking about in particular?
Yeah, well, there's a few aspects of it, and I'll try to bend that discussion towards the narrative itself, because I think there's a lot to talk about in that regard. But Lion Forge, and this is from their Roar imprint, do a really good job of their production value. And so there is the book is large, and it is hefty to hold. And so it kind of adds to the feeling that it's this sort of giant slab of story. And as you probably can see, even in the digital PDF, that a lot of the pages are sort of have that gray, almost stone-like visible quality.
Yeah, grainy looking.
Exactly. And so the book feels like this big rock. And I feel like that's a big part of the reading experience for me. Even though that grainy background shifts slightly in color to a slightly purplish gray or a greenish gray, and I think very purposefully, there's a way in which her drawings, which, I think she has this just almost like alarming simplicity, which I think is so potent for what she's trying to depict, which is so much of what's going on externally and internally and in her imagination. It feels like it's scrawled on stone, and it feels like the panel borders, which probably it comes across in the PDF as this sort of strange, I don't know, maybe like it looks like glue. It looks like glued together pieces of rock that become the panels. And I just feel like there is a thing about this book that is so much about the oppressiveness of a kind of weight. The other way that's represented is in the shadow. And then the attempt to escape it or to rise above it. And so one thing that happens is in the sheen of the pages, I don't know what you call this in terms of paper production, manufacturing, whatever. But something in the sheen of the pages makes it so that all of the characters almost have a little bit of a slight glow under the right light. And that makes them sort of stand out, come out from the sort of almost stony looking background in this way that is very, very striking. It feels like the world is quite concrete while humans are endeavoring. I'm looking at the page where she's doing yoga, and there's a way where every figure sort of pops, as if as a human being you're trying to sort of rise above the condition around you, and I just feel like that comes off really visibly in the book, and I wonder if you wouldn't get that same thing from a backlit screen.
Interesting. I mean, one of the things I noticed from the very beginning was the texture of the page. Although, I'm looking at, I don't think it's a very high resolution PDF, and I was reading it on my iPad. And I could see that the page looked grainy. I didn't think of stone. I thought of kind of a grainy paper. But again, that's kind of a difference between, I guess, the physical copy that you have and reading that and me looking at this PDF digital review copy, in that I didn't get that sense of weightedness in terms of this being something almost like a stone. Yeah, I thought of it as paper because, sometimes the way she separates panels, it looks like paper that has been folded to distinguish, one panel from the other. And there are several cases throughout the text where, I guess especially when the protagonist, Katie, is breaking down or having a problem, that the page seems to tear or, so to speak, break down as well. And so I guess that's another reason why I thought that this might be reminiscent of kind of a grainy paper. Also, in terms of my experience of reading the PDF, and I think a couple things I think I missed out on is, definitely the 2-page spreads. And there are not many, but I think a few cases in this text where looking at the 2-page spread, I think, could give a fuller effect of what was happening, or let's say something having an impact on Katie. And I didn't get that by looking at, one page at a time on this PDF through my iPad. The other thing that was a problem with this review copy, for me at least, with the PDF, is that, again, it wasn't, I don't think, high resolution. And at first, I had a problem distinguishing Katie's spoken words from her thoughts. Now, the way that Katie Green, the artist, distinguishes between someone speaking out loud and then someone thinking is that the tail to the speech or thought balloon. For speech, it will be solid, and it's thin. It's very thin,
quite thin, yeah.
And so, if you don't have a high resolution, let's say digital copy, you may not be able to tell whether the tail is actually even there or not. I guess depending on the device you're reading it from. But the thought balloons, unspoken text, is a broken tail. But again, the tail is thin, and with this non-high resolution PDF I was reading from, at times I had difficulty distinguishing a broken thin tail from a solid thin tail. In other words, I couldn't tell if Katie or someone was thinking something or saying something. I had to look really close. And so that was a problem, but that was more of a function of the resolution of the digital copy more than anything. So I wish that I had, I guess for all these reasons, a physical hard copy to review from.
I don't know how much we tend to factor this into the consideration, but the other thing about this physical book is, besides being hefty, it is also $20, which is actually a very affordable price for such a big and, I think quite gorgeous book. So I feel like there's a thing about this book that, for $20, you could have gotten away with something without quite so much, you might say, fuss. But I think it seems very intentional that this book is to be accessible, but to be the size and shape and heft that it is.
Yeah. How big? You talked about it being hefty and it's 500 plus pages. How big is the book itself? Like about how tall?
I should look at the measurements. It's not far from 8.5 and 11, maybe in terms of size. And then, thickness, it's, it feels almost phone book like, so the quite thick paper stock. So it's enough that the page turns feel significant. I'll put it that way.
I just looked on Amazon, and it is 7.7 inches by 1.4 by 10.
There you go.
So there you are. That's the size of the book.
Yeah.
Now, had you heard of Katie Green before? Is this her first book?
That's a good question. As far as I know, it is because I hadn't heard of her before. But like you were saying at the top, all of a sudden I'm hearing about this book everywhere. And it's partly the publicist work, but also I think there's some widespread acknowledgement. The other place where I'd heard of Katie Green is a conversation I had with Katrina Chapman, who is a cartoonist herself and also a publicist at Avery Hill in the UK. That's right. Yeah, and so I believe they're friends or good acquaintances. And so she had mentioned Katie's work as well. So, I knew about this coming out. I was pretty excited about it. I almost forgot about it after the solicitations and stuff, and saw it on the shelf at my local comic shop, and was really so impressed picking it up and looking at it that that's really what drove me to pick it up. But I'm really glad we read it. To get into the substance of that of this rendition of her own life, it was just very, as I keep saying, moving for me. I think there's a candor and an honesty about these struggles that, there's a lot of comics and a lot of comic memoirs that are quite vulnerable. But I think there's particular ways that she told her own story that were very, very powerful for me. And I also think that the particular issues that she's dealing with, as far as body image, anorexia, even the sex abuse aspects of her story, a lot of it is about self-perception. And reading this book made me think a lot about how, it's a lot of it is about self-perception, and also your perception of others' perception of you. And I just thought a lot about how comics are remarkably effective at conveying this, because you have these, and she draws, I would say, fairly realistically in terms of proportion and so on, but they're very cartoony kind of characters. And so her ability to draw the sort of imagination in her head of what she sees in the mirror versus like what she imagines about her body, as her body is drawn to expand and to exaggerate this or that part, and then combined with the narration of her thoughts about it. I just thought that it was remarkably effective use of the medium to convey what goes on in somebody's head as they're struggling with something like anorexia. Exactly.
And, I want to comment on a couple of things that you've said. First, I guess a more minor point. You mentioned her potential friendship, you think, with Catriona at Avery Hill. And Avery Hill is a UK publisher. Now, Katie Green is from the UK. And it's interesting. And then when I first started reading this book, I didn't know that. But as I got into the text, I started seeing these little clues, one of which is the way that, let's say, words like color are spelled, right? So UK spellings. And also there are other tells, like, for instance, when someone mentions something about eating chips, and they're not referring to the potato variety. So,
that's right.
That is, I eventually realized, Katie Green is from the UK. But other than those little clues, I don't think you would really know one way or another. It's not a British centric narrative. This is something that is more universal in many ways. I guess the more significant thing that I wanted to comment on from what you said a moment ago is the way that Katie as a character envisions herself with these exaggerated images. And so we see her at times throughout the narrative really large, especially in the stomach area. And we know that literally she's not that large, but she sees herself that way. And again, that tells us something about the illness of anorexia, or the condition of anorexia, that this is how people truly do see themselves. And you can't just dismiss that as being unrealistic, because in the people who suffer from that disorder, that's the way that they see themselves. And so there are a variety of visual cues in the text that tell us about how Katie, the character, is seeing herself.
Right.
Now, along with that, one of the things that impressed me most about this book are, I guess, two major controlling visual metaphors, if we want to call them that. One, which I think functions throughout the text, from the very beginning on the cover, and that is, I guess we could call it a shadow, just because shadow's in the title. And as we see the cover, we see Katie walking in the woods and the shadow behind her. This shadow, though, is more times than not represented as her literal shadow, but it's like a black cloud that floats over her head for the most part. And anytime you see this shadow or black cloud, these squiggly dark lines, again, whatever we choose to call them, above her head. I mean, sometimes they're smaller, sometimes they're larger, and that's how Katie Green, the artist, represents what Katie, the character, is going through. So without the black cloud shadow, she seems to be okay. With a smaller black cloud shadow, she's a little self-conscious, bothered, and then when we get a large cloud shadow, then things are really bad. And there are a variety of times throughout this book where the cloud visually consumes her, just eats her up, and then covers the entire page. So that, I think, is a controlling visual metaphor that functions throughout. Another one that we don't see until, I guess, maybe the last quarter or maybe 2/3 of the book is the mouth. And in fact, the image of a mouth even opens one of the sections toward the end of the book. Again, the last, I don't know, maybe third of it. And we see her as a young adult and then, older in college. When she gets over her anorexia, then she has a problem with binging. And it's important to note that she can't purge. I mean, she tries, but she can't physically purge herself. I mean, she'll run to the bathroom sometimes feeling guilty after, a binge session of just shoving food down her gullet, but she can't throw up. But in that last third or so of the book, whenever she feels that she just wants to eat and eat and eat, we see on her stomach a mouth image. And this mouth gets bigger and bigger when the urge to binge becomes stronger. So she goes from one problem, anorexia, to another problem, kind of the other end of the spectrum, binging. And, she never really, at least according to the narrative and the way that she draws Katie, the character, she never really has a problem in terms of being overweight because of the binging, but she feels that she's overweight. And and even more importantly, she feels guilty. And out of control. And again, this gets back to what we were mentioning earlier, this kind of obsessive-compulsive behavior, and feeling out of control is a big deal for her.
Again, this is another area, as you were saying, with those visual metaphors, that I think that the use of comics is really, it just really powerfully conveys what is going on, which is so hard to convey in other ways. Because, one of the things I thought about is that cloud, the shadow that you're talking about, and it is, I think it's significant that it's drawn with squiggly lines because there's this unruly sense about it. It reminds me a lot of, when Charlie Brown is frustrated It's a second reference now to Peanuts, but when Charlie Brown was frustrated, and there would be Schultz would draw those same kinds of squiggly lines above his head.
I hadn't thought about that. That's good.
And what I mean, to get a little heavy with it, I think that it made me think of when Charlie Brown has that. It's a kind of emanata, which is sort of like the comics analysis speak for the lines that emit from a character that show emotion. But, I think it's significant that I would, wonder whether or not to what extent, based on whatever definition, that we would call these emanata, because there's a way in which these emotions or whatever, these struggles do not, they feel like they haunt her rather than come out of her. In fact, there's a sequence where she is come home from the hospital, and she and her family, this is, when she's still in her adolescence, she and her family are at the dinner table where so many of these, so much of this drama plays out. and the shadow actually is hovering above the room, and eventually it actually sort of cracks open her skull and starts entering her skull, And so there's a way in which this is the extent to which this stuff is not coming out of her, but really kind of out of and beyond her control, and sort of penetrating into herself, that I think is really, really powerfully used and portrayed. So yeah, I mean, I think that that's a really adept use of this kind of visual metaphor throughout the text, and does all kinds of different things. I hadn't thought about that with the mouth, but it works in exactly that same way.
Yeah. I think that for me, at least, those metaphors are some of the most powerful parts of this narrative. Along with that, and I wanted to ask you your thoughts on this. We've already discussed the fact that we do get to see an older Katie Green who is writing her own story. And when we get into the last, definitely quarter of this memoir, we see Katie, the character, in art school and how she uses art as a way of dealing with her various problems, whether it be her anorexia or later her binging on food, and especially trying to deal with being sexually molested by Jake. She uses art as a way to work through that. I wouldn't call this an author's story or a Künstlerroman, kind of an author growth story. I think that it approaches that almost. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that is a bit of the twist. It's sort of she has interest in arts. It gets suppressed by an unfriendly counselor in school who advises future occupation counselor who says, I don't know if you want to really pursue art. Look at your art grades, not that good.
Yeah.
But I do think that that's a little bit of the gem that's seeded, or to mix my metaphors here, seeded early and then really becomes the outcome of the story. But yeah, I don't know too much about what the strictures of a Künstlerroman would be to say whether this was or was not that. I do think that it's really interesting that the art and the work becomes the therapeutic salvation for this character.
Yeah, I guess for me, a classic Künstlerroman is James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. The title just suggests as much.
Sure.
And in that sense, I wouldn't call Lighter Than My Shadow a Künstlerroman or an artist growth narrative. At least until we get to the last quarter of the book, when art becomes much more significant. I think that if her art had been more in the forefront from the very beginning, I'd be more apt to look at this as something more like a Künstlerroman. But art does definitely play an important role in her therapy, in her growth, and in the story itself.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think that, again, one of the things about the physical book is that if you look at it from the side, the whole thing is in these grays, but there's a chunk that you can kind of see that's coming up where all the pages are white. And that sequence, and I won't give too much of it away, although, we've pretty much talked through most of the main twists and turns of the book, but I think that is very much a reconciliation, almost a climactic reconciliation moment. And that moment is really, becomes centered on this notion of her being able to draw herself. And, I mean, being able to turn your anxieties and difficulties to art and to self-expression is itself significant. But I do think that for this, there's like another layer to it where, Katie's struggles are about, again, her perception of self and perception of body, her perception of others as perceptions. And there's something specific to becoming, say, a comics artist, that she is drawing herself. That's a really important part of this moment of, sort of her picking up and moving forward. And to be able to draw yourself and to be able to, create a different perception or to create the narrative of who you are, seems like a particularly apt kind of, a kind of freedom, a kind of liberation for her particular struggles.
Right. And, I'm glad that you brought up that section where you have a series of just white pages or blank pages. And again, we don't want to give too much away here, but this is, I think, a very important moment of the text in a variety of ways. I think it's important because what Katie Green, the author, does in this section, and this begins around, 390 some, and lasts until about 407, 408. What she does is she employs a variety of the visual strategies that she has been using earlier in the text. So, you do have the blank pages, which are kind of a counterpart to the earlier pages that are just completely black. You also have her coming apart or disintegrating, and along with that, the page or the paper, we were talking about the texture earlier, tearing and falling apart and disintegrating like she, as a character, is falling apart. And also another thing it does is what we were discussing about. It underscores in places this section. Her as an artist, because as she is breaking down because of what she's doing or about to do or thinking about doing, it seems at least the way I read it, she's not literally drawing, but she is maybe figuratively attempting to come to grips with what she's doing by envisioning herself drawing. Not only herself, but moments of her life that were really important. And, after those several pages, there is something that is anomalous in this narrative, and that is a page of just text. We have pages that are completely blank or completely black. Okay, so that's not unusual. But I think this, on page 403, is the only instance where you have just text. And and she says here on this, just text page, the months around that turning point, because she as a character sees that as a turning point, are a muddle in my memory. Looking back, it's easy to think that things changed in that single moment. Certainly it's more dramatic to tell it that way, though I don't remember much of when or how. I know I had to make that decision more than once, more than a few times. In truth, it was a process of gently reminding myself every time I was drawn to the medicine cabinet, to sharp objects or high places, no, this is not what I want. And then she goes on for about another paragraph or so. But, she as a character is telling us that this was a turning point in her life. And in many ways, it was something that wasn't just a one-off, but it's something that she had to keep coming back to again and again. So another struggle for her. This whole book is just a series of struggles for Katie, and this is yet another. So this is an important moment in the book. So I'm glad you brought it up.
Yeah, I'd agree with you. I think this is the pivotal point, and I do think it's significant, and I do think that it's fair to ask this question, but I think it's significant that, as you said, that page of text, which comes right after that series of white pages that we discussed, comes 400 pages into a 500-page book. And so, there's still a 20% of the book to go, and you could have neatly cut off the narrative a few pages after that with some kind of resolution. You know what I mean? But I do think it's significant that she goes on. And in that going on, a lot of that is her flowering as an artist, but a lot of that is also just representing that the struggle is ongoing. And she talks in the beginning of the book about the notion of being in recovery. And I don't know if her meaning of recovery is the same as what I think of. I think of 12-step programs and AA and things like that. But there's a sense in which you don't you're not done. You're never done with your addiction or your struggle. You're constantly working your recovery. And so those last 100 pages to me are a really important representation of how the art becomes a means of working her recovery, and I think that they achieve a special kind of power from that lens, added on to the power of the previous 400 pages of this extraordinarily honest story. One more thing I guess I just want to note is there's a way that us talking about all of these important parts of the book is really somber, but I was also really moved by how she represented her friends and family, because there's a compassion, you can see things that her friends say subtly or her family members do subtly that, I think often in stories like these, somebody is trying to say, yeah, these were the events and the careless words somebody said that touched me off, that made it so that I had this difficulty. But there's none of that here. I feel like things that her friends and family members say are things that I would have probably tried to say to a loved one, or a loved one would have said to me, and I think it helps me to imagine being in her shoes, in some ways, not to that extent, but I've been in those shoes, and to look around at your loved ones, and to feel a sense that people are for me, and yet this thing yet this thing continues to haunt me. I think that's just an aspect of this kind of story that is important, because she winds up also drawing on those same people as a source of strength, oftentimes, and so the whole portrayal of the others in her life, I thought was touching. It also gave me the capacity to imagine being in their shoes as well. And what do you say, and how do you help? How do you regret things that you may have said? All that stuff was part of the narrative as well for me. Exactly.
Her parents are represented in a very sympathetic way. She doesn't draw them as nagging, as hovering, as being, too concerned. Right. At one point in the text, Katie, the character, becomes rebellious. This is around the time that she begins doing therapy sessions with Jake, and she feels that she's in more control. And Jake even encourages her to express herself and to assert herself against what her parents want her to do. And so, but nonetheless, the parents are represented, I think, in a very sympathetic way, and her friends as well. And there's one in particular, Megan, that is important, and we see her a few times throughout this story. And I think the most significant moment, that we find between an exchange between Katie and Megan, is when Katie tells Megan about her relationship with Jake, and the way that this is before she realizes that Jake has been molesting her, right? Because and we've touched upon Jake, but we haven't talked in detail. When her father, Katie's father, first takes her to Jake's, I don't know if you want to call it home, his campsite, because they have a couple of
quote unquote office,
a couple of teepees.
Right.
Basically, what he does is he has her lay down, and then he cups her head and, I guess, talks with her and touches her, non-sexually from what we can see at first, in such a way that it relaxes her. And then we see her metaphorically floating above her own body. In other words, she becomes at peace, she floats away, and this seems to be very therapeutic. She appears to be getting better and in more self-control after seeing Jake. It's not until later, when she's at some kind of, I don't know, like Renaissance festival, fair, something like that, with Jake. And, Jake is married with a kid. But
who's around? They're all around during all this.
That's right. But when Katie goes off with Jake at this Renaissance fair, that's when Katie becomes aware that Jake has other intentions outside of being a good therapist, because without putting her to sleep or relaxing her, he starts to grope her, and it dawns on her. I mean, she runs away after that, but then it dawns on her later that during those moments of therapy, he touched me, and she was just either so out of it she didn't realize it, or she, I think better yet, she didn't want to admit it to herself. She was just psychologically blocking it out. And so when Katie is talking with Megan at one point, this is before she is overtly molested at the fair, Megan says, sounds like something creepy. I wouldn't, I'd break off my relationship with this guy. And Katie's taken aback. And so they have an argument, and they don't speak again for the longest time. But then Katie realizes, Jake has been molesting me. And then that becomes, I think, the main problem for her to overcome in the last quarter of the book.
Yeah, I think that is, it becomes, well, in many ways it heightens a lot of the things that have been ongoing for her. Yeah, I mean, I think she treats all of this with a great deal of sensitivity, and again, like a great deal of just really bracing honesty. It is something that I think is hard for a lot of readers to encounter, myself included. Mm-hmm. And I do think she prepares us for it, and maybe even prepares those who may not be able to go there with her for that. But yeah, it's even hard for me to talk about. I want to punch Jake in the mouth.
Yeah.
But I do think that she just handles all that with just great sensitivity, and it's just very powerful.
Yeah. Now, before we move on to the next title, I want to ask you one more question, and this, I think, touches upon something that you and I were mentioning a little bit over the weekend. You and I were talking, and I was telling you about my experiences in reading Lighter Than My Shadow, and I told you that there were places in this book where I thought that Katie Green, the author, may have been overdoing the problems that Katie, the character, has. In other words, revisiting the anorexia, or revisiting the binging, or revisiting her trauma at being sexually molested a little too much. And we've mentioned that this is a more than 500-page book. So, I mean, again, it's quite hefty. And I was wondering if maybe Green could have streamlined some of the story a bit. Did you get a sense that, especially with the anorexia part in the first half, that there was a little too much emphasis on this? In other words, it seemed, I don't want to say repetitive, but this emphasis on her problem seemed at times a little bit too much, that we were getting too much of this.
That's a great question, and I do think that that might be a response readers may have, and I think it's a fair response, of course. I think what I caught on to early on, and maybe this is from having flipped through the book enough and seen the squiggly line shadows, for instance, is the idea that we would not be dealing with something that is going to be easily or quickly resolved. And so each time she comes back to a reintroduction or another way that she is discussing her struggles with food and body and so forth, I feel like there's another dimension that's toggled or put forward. One account of it may have to do with the influence of, what happens when she's talking to her friends. Another account of it is a reflection on the way that her family members talk to her about it. You know what I mean? So I know what you mean, that we come back to this again and again, and I think that's probably partly an intended effect. But I did think that every re-exploration had something unique to, an aspect of this unique to think about that I didn't ever sort of, my attention or energy didn't really flag. Again, maybe it's because so much of this spoke to me so powerfully and so personally that each time seemed, whatever dimension she was putting the spotlight on seemed relevant to me. But I could easily see that it does feel, like you said, like, wow, we are 400 pages through this struggle. It's definitely a long haul. And I imagine that's how it felt for her in real life too.
Yeah. I mean, and that's a good point, how it felt for her. And so this, in fact, we even get this, that she is bothered by the fact that she's never going to be able to shake these problems, right? She's always going to be binging. She's always going to be obsessed and then traumatized by what Jake did to her. So I guess maybe coming back to that again and again, these various problems is part of what the story is about. Let me just say, I don't want to say that it was too repetitive, right? Too much emphasis on the anorexia, then too much emphasis on the binging, then too much emphasis on the Jake trauma. At least enough to turn me off. At no point in reading Lighter Than My Shadow did I feel, I've just got to put this down. This is just too much. It's too repetitive. But in reading it, I kind of wondered, might she have cut this down a little bit? But I wanted to get your take on that.
Yeah.
Okay, let's turn to the next book that we're looking at for this week, and this is the anthology Now, #1. It's edited by Eric Reynolds, and it's coming out from Fantagraphics. And this was actually released in late September. I was really excited when I saw a couple of months ago, 2 or 3 months ago now, Now #1 being solicited, because in my experience, Fantagraphics, for the most part, does a really good job when it comes to anthologies. To me, the pinnacle of Fantagraphics anthologies is Mome.
Right.
I absolutely loved Mome when it was out, and I got every issue. I couldn't wait until it came out. And I was really sad when they discontinued Mome. Now, Fantagraphics has had anthologies since then, but they really haven't succeeded or resonated as Mome did. I remember back in 2014, Jason T. Miles edited Insect Bath, the anthology. And I think there was only... it was published by Profanity Hill, distributed through Fantagraphics, so I don't know if it's technically a Fantagraphics book. I got it through Fantagraphics, but I think there was only one issue of Insect Bath. I'm not sure, but I've been waiting for something like Mome since Mome discontinued, and I thought that Now would be it. And I think in many ways it is, or at least it almost is. Now, were you familiar? Did you read Mome?
Yeah, I did. I caught on pretty late. I think it ended in maybe 2012 or 2011. Yeah, I think I read my first Mome maybe in 2008. So
okay,
but then I had this back catalog of great stuff to pick up, at used bookstores and stuff. So it's pretty great.
Yeah. Now, how do you think Now #1 compares to what Mome was?
I feel like there's a little bit more. Maybe I'm wrong about this. Let me say what I was going to say, and then maybe I need to take it back immediately. Okay. A little bit more experimentation and variety in Now, but maybe not. Maybe I'm only remembering Mome for lengthier pieces that hit a certain way. I don't know. Did you get any sense of that?
I don't know if it's any more experimental than Mome.
Right.
I think one of the first things I noticed, and I have a hard copy of Now #1, is that it is magazine sized, or at least it's larger format than Mome was.
Than Mome,
yeah,
right.
And the pages are fine. The covers, it strikes me, the front and back cover, they're a little thin. I don't know. I mean, not too thin, but with Mome we had thicker, almost like thin cardboard
like a book
covers. Yeah, like a book,
right.
And this is more like a magazine. And I have no problem with this. It's just a different, to a certain degree, different physical package. I think that the contributions, and we have 14 stories. Or 14 pieces, I don't know if we want to call them stories, in the first issue of Now. That's not counting the front and back covers,
right?
Which also get credited in it's listed on the back. I mean, the back is in essence the table of contents.
Right.
So you have about the size, I guess, of what Mome was, and the stories seem to be, I guess, more or less what I remember from Mome. There's some names that I recognize. There's some names that are, I think most of them are brand new to me. But that was my experience with Mome, right? There were some people that I knew and some people that I didn't, but now I do. And they're very familiar to me. But at the time, back in 2006, 2007, I didn't know who these people were. I was just being introduced to them.
Right.
So I'm sure the same experience is going to happen with Now.
Yes.
The second issue of Now is going to come out in January. Then later, I think in the spring, late spring, issue #3 of Now is going to come out. So we know that at least 3 issues are going to be coming out of Now.
Yep. And I don't know if you mentioned, but Eric Reynolds, same editor responsible for Mome, is also, I think you did say already, this is an Eric Reynolds joint, but
yeah.
Mome as well, for folks who didn't know. Yeah.
Yeah, and Eric Reynolds is a fixture at Fantagraphics. I've met him in SPX. He's a great guy. He has been very kind to the podcast in the past by seeing that we do get review copies and helps to publicize the fact that we review Fantagraphics titles. Yeah. So that's great. And whenever we do, he says that we have good taste. So that's fine. Okay, so as I mentioned, there are 14 stories, not counting the front and back covers. One of the challenges of reviewing and discussing an anthology is, how do you deal with the various contributions? Do you talk about which ones are your favorite, which ones are your least favorite? I mean, how do you want to go about this? Because what I have noted is the ones that really stand out to me. I've also noted the ones that kind of most confuse me.
Right. Yeah, and that's part of the job of an anthology too, I'm sure. I realize that if there's an anthology that everything tastes the same to me, then it's totally forgettable. It means that everything was bland. And maybe we can do that. Maybe we can have the discussion this way, just a proposal. We can talk about how it felt as a whole. You've already said a few things, but and then we can delve into a few of the either favorites or maybe preferred specific stories, that we can pick out to talk about. Did you have a feeling of it as a whole? I mean, is there a way that something that bound these together for you, or did it feel like it satisfied the sort of mission statement of what it's trying to do as an anthology in terms of exposure and experimenting and things like that?
I think it succeeded in what it set out to do, and part of the reason why I say that is after the first story, which is called Constitutional, and that's a one-pager by Sarah Corbett. Eric Reynolds writes a couple of paragraphs about kind of introducing this new anthology, and it's titled "Why Now?" ? And in essence, what he says is that he's always loved anthologies, and one of the things he wants to do with now is to include a variety of not only established but also brand new creators. But creators who are diverse in how they draw and how they tell stories or how they represent reality. And to me, it's the diversity that I think really stands out when Reynolds mentions that in this foreword or introduction. Because I do think that as a collection or as an anthology of different kinds of comics art, it succeeds because there are a variety of different types of art and comic storytelling in this. I mean, there's some narratives that are coherent stories. The standout one for me, I'll have to say, it's my favorite, and that is Noah Van Sciver's Wall of Shame.
That's right.
And then there are others that are loose stories, and I'm thinking of J.C. Menu's SOS Suitcases, that tells a story, but in a very surreal, disjointed way. And then there are other pieces where story seems to be, if not absent, then definitely taking a back seat to the art. And maybe an example of that would be something that I already mentioned, the very first piece, Sarah Corbett's Constitutional. And so, again, you have a variety of different kinds of comics art and comic storytelling. And I like that, and that's what Eric Reynolds set out to do, and I think he succeeded in doing so.
Yeah, and so, for those of us who like this kind of stuff, we're anchored by familiar voices or familiar, creators like Eleanor Davis and Dash Shaw and Gabrielle Bell and, as you said, Noah Van Sciver and Sammy Harcum are all here. Although some of them are doing different things from their sort of usual fare. So that's kind of a cool thing. But then, spliced between those are, as they said in some of the solicit, international creators like J.C. Menu, Conchita Herrero, Tobias Shulkin, I'm gonna guess that's pronounced. So and also sort of a international flavor as well.
Right. Another thing I appreciate about this first issue of Now, and what I expect from future issues. Yeah.
Hopefully, I mean, again, as like a Mome fan, like this, I'm here for this. I'm totally gonna keep picking this up. I thought it does do that very effective thing of giving us these morsel-sized pieces from people that we've sort of long read, and then exposing us. Now I'm going to want to see Conchita Herrero's future stuff because I really, intrigued enough. I mean, there's an extent to which I always feel the dissatisfaction too. That there's a side of reading anthologies that you're just like, I'm just getting into this, and we're done. And so, but that's probably a good thing. That's probably some of the intended, effect.
Yeah, and you mentioned Herrero's contribution, which is Here I Am, and this is a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 story. So it's relatively short, but it's a short story that is based on Gabrielle Bell's Cecil and Jordan in New York. For those who know that work. And I think to some degree it is. I don't think it's based heavily on it, but I think it takes Cecil and Jordan in New York as a springboard, especially, in referencing the chair.
Right.
But I appreciated that. I have to say, and this is, I was about to say a problem of mine. I don't know if I'd call it a problem, but I think it's a propensity maybe. Those pieces that I enjoyed the most, that really stood out to me, are by creators that I was already familiar with. Like I said, my favorite by far contribution in this first issue of Now is Noah Van Sciver's Wall of Shame. Now, I love Noah Van Sciver's work. I've read most everything he's done. And Wall of Shame, I think, is a really well-written, substantive story. It's one of the longest pieces in this issue. And I think that there's also a lot of humor embedded in that story, which I appreciate. So I love that. I also really enjoy Gabrielle Bell's one-page piece, Dear Naked Guy. And it's Gabrielle Bell doing what Gabrielle Bell does best. And then Dash Shaw's Scorpio. Those are the three that really stood out. I think to a lesser degree, Eleanor Davis's Hurt or Fuck. And yes, you did hear the title correctly, Hurt or Fuck. So I'll have to put an explicit tag on this show because I just said the word fuck 3 times now. That was, I really like Eleanor Davis's work as a whole. This is a little different. I liked it, but it's not my favorite thing that I've read of hers. But again, it did to some degree kind of stand out. But again, the thing about all 4 of those authors, Dash Shaw, Noah Van Sciver, Gabrielle Bell, and Eleanor Davis, I know their work. And I'm wondering if my draw to those stories of feeling that and listing them in my notes as, my favorites of this anthology may have more to do with my familiarity with them than with the quality of their stories. I don't think that that's the case entirely because, again, I think that Dear Naked Guy, Wall of Shame, those are great pieces, are very well done, well drawn, well written. But it's almost like comfort food, right? It's food that you go back to because you like it and it's going to feel good to eat it. Whereas experimenting with something you've never eaten before is a little chancy. So, for instance, as much as I could appreciate to a large degree J.C. Menu's SOS suitcase, it
what the heck is going on?
What the heck is going on? That and Antoine Cossi's statue, those are 2 selections that I had to read twice because I didn't feel that I understood what was going on the first time around. Not that I felt that I understood things better that second go-round, but I think that that's the kind of stories that they are, right? They're more symbolic or more, in the case of SOS Suitcases, surreal. In many ways, dreamlike. And so I think that they're supposed to confuse. And so I'm okay with that. But again, I was really drawn to, let's say, Gabrielle Bell, Noah Van Sciver, Dash Shaw, and Eleanor Davis's pieces because I already knew their work. And so how much, again, I keep asking myself, how much of my draw to those stories are the fact that I really like these guys, I love these creators, and how much of it is these individual stories, Scorpio, Dear Naked Guy, Wall of Shame, and Hurt or Fuck, that stand out and are strong on their own terms.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, I think, I do think that there's some overlap between the creators here that we're more familiar with, their larger oeuvre. And those stories which are more traditional, I don't know, traditional is not the right word, but like you were saying, not so expressionistic or surreal or whatever. So Scorpio, for instance, and Wall of Shame by Noah Van Sciver, and even the Sammy Harcum one-page piece, I, Marlin, are sort of a little bit easier to gloss than like you said, the JC Menu, SOS Suitcase, or again some of those pieces. For me, a good test was the as you said, The Hurt or Fuck by Eleanor Davis, which I do think is more abstract. And actually I read that before realizing it was Eleanor Davis, because I'm used to her heavy use of color, and this is a very spare pencil kind of story. And it wasn't really until I got through it that I was like, wait, who did this? And I went, oh, of course it's Eleanor Davis. Those strokes are so familiar to me. But in terms of the kind of storytelling and in terms of the art, it was just a little bit of a departure for me. But yeah, I don't know. I do think that we keep using the food metaphor. It's a buffet, and certainly the familiar things are also the things that are, that we knew how to attach the names to, the mac and cheese, so to speak, of the buffet. And then there's these little more, out there things that, I think that's why I felt like on a whole it was really effective for me as an anthology. This is kind of what I want my anthologies to do. Give me some good old Noah Van Sciver, and then show me something like, actually I wasn't familiar with Tommy Parrish. That piece, Untitled, sort of a transgender relationship story. I got through it. I was like, oh, who is this creator? Realized that I have a Tommy Parrish work from 2D Cloud. I think it's called Perfect Hair, but I just hadn't read it. And so, it was sort of like, oh, yeah, I need to go back and read that, because this little tidbit made me realize, oh, okay, I like this stuff. I want to see more of it. So in that sense, it worked.
Yeah. Another standout contribution for me that I haven't mentioned yet is Malachi Ward and Matt Sheenan's Widening Horizon. And this story is interesting in that it is, I guess, an alternate history of the space race. And it's funny because the first one or two pages, they present the space race in such a way that it seems like it could be real, right? Because I say, well, I'm not familiar with these people, but then again, I'm not an expert or any kind of aficionado when it comes to the history of space exploration. And so, of course, I don't know who these characters are. But then, after you get into page 3, 4, so on, because this is kind of a longish piece as well, you realize this is not what actually happened. And
that's not right.
Yeah, exactly. But I like that. I like those kind of alternate histories, and the way that Ward and Sheenan present it, I think, is really smart.
Yes. Agree. I thought that was a good piece. And if we're talking about a few favorites, I kept thinking about Noah Van Sciver's family, because I've always wondered a lot about his relationship with his other cartoonist brother and how just drastically different they are. As he talks about going home and how hard it is for him to go home and to deal with his other brother. But I also think that I liked the Gabrielle Bell piece as well. There's something that stands out to me about the Kayla Graham piece, Pretend We're Orphans. Did you know Kayla Graham before this?
No, I didn't. But I really did enjoy this story. And this is another one of these kind of like abstract narratives.
Yes.
But it's one that when I read it, let's say, unlike, Antoine Cossé's Statue, I did feel that I had a pretty good grasp of it just the first time around.
Right. Yeah. I felt the same. And my maybe tenuous grasp of it, nonetheless, gave me a lot of evoked a lot of these feelings. It's a beautiful piece. It kind of takes you back to that terror and strangeness of being a kid, and how you want to kind of, when you're a kid, you just, I guess as adults too, but you want to lurk in the scary parts of your imagination and things like that. So I just thought that was really effective. But yeah, actually, I liked all the pieces that you named as well. The Scorpio hit home far too much. That bit is about a couple giving birth during during the news of the election, which I just remember that night last year, and the pit in my stomach watching on our cell phones as these New York Times, what do you call it, that little 99% Hillary Clinton just suddenly turned the other way.
Yeah.
Like, what is happening? And so there's this feeling that something apocalyptic is happening while, meanwhile life goes on and people give birth and so on. So that was a pretty affecting little bit there.
Yeah. One contribution we haven't mentioned even in passing yet is Daria Tesler's Songs in the Key of Grief. And that's another one that it's kind of a crime story, but at the same time it's kind of abstractly told, kind of similar to the one that precedes that, Graham's Pretend We're Orphans. And I enjoyed that as well, although I'm not sure I understand what's going on there. But that's okay.
That's right. That's what we're here for, right?
That's right.
Yeah. Overall, I would say I would enjoy. In fact, I did enjoy rereading probably 5 or 6 of these pieces, and then the rest I just enjoyed reading. I'm glad that I spent some time there. So, good job. Now I'm in for now. My mom love is transferred over, and you have my money.
Yeah, exactly. I'm definitely going to be on board for future issues of Now. One more thing about this, and specifically the Noah Van Sciver piece, Wall of Shame. You mentioned that. One of the standouts in this story for you is Noah Van Sciver, and this is autobiographical, it seems.
Right.
In his relationship with his family to some degree, especially his younger brother. This is not the first Noah Van Sciver story where we get him representing himself and his relationship with his family. And I really do enjoy that side of Noah Van Sciver. I like his other comic storytelling as well. Like, for instance, when he writes about, let's say Abraham Lincoln in The Hypo. And I guess he has this new book coming out on Johnny Appleseed, which I have on order. I think that's coming out later this month. But, I really do like it when he writes about himself and what he goes through, especially in relation to his family. And one of the things that really stood out to me, and I thought it was hilarious, is every now and again, the character in this story, Noah Van Sciver, is writing down in a notebook ideas for a comic. And after his brother picks him up at the airport, and his younger brother is just this... he means well. He seems like a good-natured guy, but he's a bit of a buffoon. And he also is, to call him a ladies' man, I think, is to be too kind. He's someone who sleeps around, who doesn't respect women, but the women that he hooks up with, they don't necessarily want to be respected. So after his brother picks him up and takes him back to the house and kind of tries Noah Van Sciver's patience, Noah is in his mother's house. He's sitting on the couch, and he pets the cat because the cat's litter box is right there near the couch. And he
where he's sleeping.
Exactly. Right. And he writes down in his notebook, story idea, held captive by family member or members, which is really funny. But it's a subtle kind of humor, and it's the kind that Noah Van Sciver does best. So I really did appreciate that moment, but also the story as a whole.
Yeah, fan of that one. I really liked the. It's a familiar note for him. I haven't read his complete works, but what I have read, I've really liked, and it does sound like him. I think probably my favorite is just the I, Marlon, the Sammy Harkin bit with a sort of meditative Marlon Brando on his island in Tahiti, because. Did you see that documentary, the Listen to Me Marlon documentary that came out last year? I can't remember.
No, I didn't.
Who was behind it, but it was basically composed completely of tapes of Marlon Brando, philosophizing to himself into an audio recorder and overlaid over, scenes of his youth and his career and so forth. But Marlon Brando's always been this fascinating figure to me, where there's something really like tragic about him and very real. And also something kind of ludicrous at the same time. And, like a little bit just like so self-indulgent that I'm going to buy an island and then I'm going to romanticize all the people on them and marry them. And, he just, and so all of that, it seems to that one page just seems to capture so much of who Marlon Brando is, you know, philosophical, and yet pretty tongue-in-cheek about about how silly it all is. So I think Sammy Harcum did a beautiful one-page Marlon Brando, you know, rendition right there.
Yeah, you know, I'm glad that you gave a little more attention to Harcum's contribution. I think the reason why it didn't resonate with me, again, he's another one of these creators that I definitely recognize, in whose work I absolutely love. But I think the reason why I didn't list this as something that really resonated with me is because it was a one-pager. Now, on the other hand, Gabriel Bell's Dear Naked Guy is a one-pager as well. But I think, I don't know, maybe because it came at the very end, it didn't stick with me in the way that the others did. But I definitely like Harcum's work, and you're right, this is a good piece. I wish it had been maybe a little longer, but, you know.
Yeah.
It's good for what it is.
Yeah.
Okay, let's look at the last title that we're going to be discussing this week, and it is Justin Jordan, Nikki Ryan, and Morgan Beam's The Family Trade, issue number 1, and this is coming out from Image Comics, and in fact, it came out on the 11th, so that was last week. Justin Jordan, we've discussed Justin Jordan on the show a little bit in the past. You know, he's the author of the writer of Spread, Luther Strode, Dead Body Road, among other titles. And I don't know, what did you think of this first issue of The Family Trade?
I gotta admit that I'm not a huge fan of Justin Jordan's previous work, and we should mention writing this with Nikki Jordan. Luther Strode and Spread are the kind of things that I can recognize as good, just not necessarily my favorite style or genre or whatever. But really, it was one, that this story is quite different, and two, art just knocked my socks off. Like, this is my stuff. It's done in a watercolory sort of style that reminds me a lot of Bandette, Colleen Coover and Paul Tobin, as well as artists like Tyler Jenkins, and maybe a little bit of
I was going to say, although not as cartoony as Bandette.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. That's right. Bandette more cartoony. Tyler Jenkins not so cartoony. Right. Still watercolory. Maybe right in between them is what I'd say. Yeah. And then the world that they make. Basically, the premise is that there's a city in the ocean. It's called the Float.
In the middle of the Atlantic.
That's right. It's the Free Republic of Thessaly. I guess everybody calls it the Float. And in a world that's like divided by conflict, this is sort of a neutral zone. And so while these ship captains who built the Float are sort of jostling and wrestling over different kinds of control, this family that is working underground to protect and maintain it, is kind of inducting its youngest member, which is Jessa, and I feel like those aspects of the story are familiar to me, but what I really liked was the ways that Beam, her style just adds so much to the to the sense of the world as being something very lively, a little uncertain, and actually here's where I had those various comparisons, but it's really Matt Kint's work that this reminds me the most of. And have you read Department H, which is Kint's?
Oh yeah, I love that. I love that title.
Yeah, and Department H makes me think, why haven't you been doing this your whole life? Because it's set underwater. And so there's something that's really perfect about the flowiness of the colors in that work. And it just does something that's just kind of pitch perfect for the mystery of that story. And a lot of that carries over for me into what's going on in the Family Trade. Like a bit of fun, also a little bit of intrigue, and also a lot of like sort of like watery, what's going on here-ness that I really like. Yeah.
You mentioned the Float, and this is interesting. I didn't think it was awkward. I mean, many times when an author, and not just of comics, but I think of any kind of narrative, attempts exposition, there's always the risk of it coming across as a little too obvious and clunky.
Right.
I don't think that that's the case in Family Trade, issue number 1, or at least I didn't get that feeling. So basically what we see at the very beginning is, our protagonist, Jessa Wynn, who is a member of the family, and she enters the bedroom. She breaks into the bedroom of someone named Stagger Burkhart. Now, we don't know that that's who this is at the very beginning. We learned that later in the issue. And he's someone who is a very charismatic character. He's someone who really appeals to the masses of the float. I don't know about you, but he reminded me of something like a Donald Trump kind of character, the things that he was
completely.
saying. Yeah. And so I'm wondering when they wrote this part of issue number 1. But she can't do it. She can't kill him. And she's discovered. She makes her escape. And after she goes through whatever she goes through during her escape, which is, kind of harrowing, then she, in essence, turns to us as a narrator and says, I guess while I follow the 15-pound barrel of attitude, she's referring to a cat, I should fill you in on what you need to know. And then what she does is she gives us a little background. And so... on the one hand, it could come across this sudden turn to the reader where she's addressing the reader, hey, you're probably wondering where I am and what's going on. Well, let me tell you. As a little clunky. I didn't necessarily see it that way. But in this, what is it? I guess it's about 3-4 page exposition. She tells us about the history of the float. And so basically, the float is the result of this grand armada from some, I'm assuming, European country, although we're not told what nation it is, sending out this large armada, but the king who's ruling this nation is a little crazy. So, it's sounding a little bit like England. And the captains of the various ships of their armada just decided, hey, we're not going to follow the whims of this crazy king. And so what they do is they basically stop in the middle of the Atlantic and they begin building this one nation, or this one area, if we want to call it. I don't know if this is a nation, from the ships, and this eventually becomes the float. And the captains on the various ships are members of the various clans, and so they're called the clans. And then those who worked on the ships eventually become the family, and they all become interconnected. And it's a little unclear from this exposition, 4 pages, if they're actually family in the related sense, or if they are just close in terms of having worked together, or a combination. The combination is what I kind of thought that they meant.
That seems to be the case, although they do call each other Uncle Christian and, so on. So, but whether that's actual biologically or not, is uncertain, I think. Yeah.
And then after this exposition piece, we're introduced briefly to one character that I'm assuming will play a larger role in the issues to follow. And this is someone called the Bookmaker. And Jessa tells us that he runs the family. Now, in what way does he run the family? We don't exactly know yet. But basically, he says to Jessa and her uncle, that she's talking with, that she shouldn't have attempted to assassinate Stagger Burkhart, and it's a good thing that she failed at doing so, because there could have been really dire consequences had she succeeded. Now, we don't know exactly why there would be dire consequences, what the consequences would be, what the relationship of Stagger Burkhart is, to the clans, the family, the Bookmaker, Jessa, all of that. But again, I mean, this first issue is not necessarily supposed to answer all those questions. I think what a first issue does, and we've talked about this a number of times on the podcast, a first issue should pose the questions, should set the premise, and give you enough to where you feel comfortable with, but you definitely feel impelled to pick up the next issue. And if that is what a successful first issue is, I have to tell you, this is a successful first issue for me.
It works for you. Yeah,
it didn't work as much for you?
No, it does. But I'll tell you. So, and I think that was all an excellent description of what the story is doing, and I do think there is, within what you described about the story, enough intrigue to pull somebody in. But I do think that one thing this book has working against it for me, and I want to ask you if you feel the same, is what I have heard a little bit of and definitely feel a little bit of Image Comics world building fatigue. Where every Image series is some sort of sci-fi-ish or fantasy-ish world that's being built, And, I think that makes a lot of sense. It's what I love about the books that I love at Image, from your Lazaruses to your Shutters or to, Saga or whatever, is these universes that each of these stories is able to build and the inventiveness in creating that larger world. I think what tends to happen, though, is that anytime somebody's giving me the pitch of what an Image book is, I don't mean giving me the pitch like any creators are actually giving me any pitches. I just mean like when I hear about this is what an Image book is, there's part of me that the familiarity of all these things, there's an empire, there's a government, there's a whatever, and then there's people, the rebels or whatever. It starts to make me wonder, okay, am I going to have to assemble an understanding of a whole nother world? Because right now I'm following, 10 or 12 other ones in Image right now. The things to me that are exceptions with this story and that make me want to follow it is there's the intriguing premise that you described. There's the Deem art that I really mentioned that I think is quite different. And then actually, I think the allusions to Trump are more text than subtext because his slogan, this Burkhart's slogan, is to make the float glorious again in a really familiar way, and he's sort of a populist, populist appealing candidate or whatever at this point. And I'm kind of intrigued because I do think that this is so many Image series are about power and underground power and authoritarian power, but this is a Trump era Image book, and I do think it's going to confront a lot of that stuff. And for that reason, in addition to that, the fact that the art style is almost as much the nib as it is traditional superhero comic books or something like that, to me I'm intrigued to see if the discussion is a little richer or a little bit deeper in terms of the analogs to our current politics.
What you've said, I think, makes a lot of sense in a number of ways. Well, one, I definitely agree with you in terms of Beam's art. I think that it is one of the things that really stands out in this first issue of the Family Trade. The other thing is the whole Trump thing, and I do think that this is kind of a Trump-era narrative, and I'd be curious to know how much of this was written before last November and how much of it has been changed, if at all, since November, if it, they started writing it before. But I think even more so, I'm taken with what you said about Image world-building fatigue. I've mentioned to Andy Kunka a few times on the show that, and I guess especially during previews episodes when we go through the catalog, that I used to be a few years ago an Image enthusiast. Almost everything that they publish, I'd read, or at least I'd check out. I'm less so now, and part of it is because of some kind of fatigue. And I think world building and the kind of stories that are usually told by creators who publish through Image, as you described it, is something that it's not getting on my nerves, but it's tiring me. It's like, okay, tell me something new. And I've said before in the podcast that I am a lover of more realistic, if you want to call them slice of life narratives, and not necessarily just real life relationship stories, but more realistic, let's say, crime stories. And, I mentioned earlier that Justin Jordan had written the miniseries Dead Body Road. Now, Dead Body Road, it's been a while since I've read it, but that is a narrative that is more anchored, more rooted in a reality that we know, right? So we have no fantastical world. We have no science fiction setting. Okay, so there's really not that kind of world building. Even something like, let's say, Grant Morrison's Happy. That's something that I would also argue is more realistically based, because the strange, fantastical element in that story is basically what's going on with the police inside the police officer's head. I can't remember the protagonist's name, but that is nonetheless a more realistically based story, and. You're right. I mean, there is something about most image titles where it seems to be, I don't want to say the same old, but it's a similar formula, right? I have nothing against world building, and I think it can be quite exciting when it comes to the fantastic and sci-fi. But if that's all you're getting, then it becomes a little too much. And that's why, I tend to appreciate those more realistically based, or again, slice of life, if you want to call it that, narratives. And Image doesn't do as many of those as maybe I would like, but,
Yeah. I'm the same way. And I definitely don't want this to be any blanket condemnation. I mean, Image is still producing really great stuff. An example of that is Spy Seal, which is a great example by Rich DeMoss.
Oh, yeah.
Which is something, you and I have talked a little bit about, but it's like so different and so cool, like so fun. And I want to say, I'm definitely not painting Family Trade in the same brush. In fact, I think it's, again, the differences between this and other things that I think make this intriguing and make me want to keep reading this one. But yeah, it is a thing. And so I always feel like I need to look past the solicits to see if these new Image series are going to grab me, and this one does. Yeah.
I'm gonna come back to the Family Trade for various reasons, many of which we've mentioned. Definitely Beam's art. Also, I think the protagonist Jessa Wynn is intriguing. I want to learn more about her, and also this mystery of the bookmaker. What is his relationship? I want to find out more about him. I'll come back to this. Now, I'm wondering. I don't see this on the Image site. Is Family Trade a limited series? Is it going to be ongoing? It doesn't say.
So what I've read is that they have several story arcs in mind.
Okay.
The team does. Although, like a lot of these Image series, I imagine they want to see how the first arc goes and sales-wise. But I think Justin Jordan said in an interview that like Luther Strode, there's a bigger story, but unlike Luther Strode, I don't think they intend to release it as a series of minis the way that Luther Strode was, but as a continuously numbered thing, more like a lot of other Image series, I think.
Well, that's good, because I don't like, and I've said this on the show a number of times, I don't like it when creators or publishers do a series of miniseries. In other words, it's what I call taking the Hellboy route. Now, Hellboy can do it, that's fine, because it started out doing that. And so, no problem with that. But when you have a comic series that, starts off by continuous numbers, and then it stops, and then you have a new number one, but then the title has a subtitle that distinguishes it as it's, a completely separate miniseries. It's like, just do the continuous title thing, And maybe it's because it's the kind of comics that I grew up with as a kid, right? You did get beyond issue number 12. In fact, you got in the hundreds. And there's nothing wrong with that. But it's good that they're going to, from what you've heard, continuously number the various issues, regardless of which narrative arc it's in.
Yeah. I hope I'm picking up Family Trade 23 sometime, like I am with stuff like Department H. So yeah.
So 3 really interesting titles that Paul and I discussed this week. We started off with Katie Green's Lighter Than My Shadow, and that comes out from Lion Forge in their Roar imprint. After that, we looked at Eric Reynolds as editor of Now, issue number 1, and this came out from Fantagraphics. And then we wrapped up with a discussion of The Family Trade number 1, written by Justin Jordan and Nikki Ryan, with art by Morgan Beam. So 3 good titles. And as Paul pointed out at the top of the show, you can find, let's say, future issues of Family Trade solicited on DCB Service, as well as other issues of Now, and even Lighter Than My Shadow at, 30% off? Did you say?
Yes.
Yeah. So great discounts on the books that we discussed this week, and many, many other titles at dcbservice.com. Go there right now. You'll find great discounts. You will not be disappointed. And after you do get your titles there, get in touch with us and let us know what you're going to be reading. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you could leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up the phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
We also can be contacted by email at twoguys, TWOGUYS, at comicsalternative.com. I'm at Paul at comicsalternative.com, and Derek's at Derek, DEREK, at comicsalternative.com. I don't know why I felt the need to spell Two Guys and Derek, but not Paul. So PAUL at comicsalternative.com. Yeah. But we do love hearing from you. So any kind of correspondence through any of these means would be lovely. We want to hear what you think about the books we're talking about and about our discussion.
Exactly. You know, you can also communicate with us via social media, such as on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, and YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn, on iHeartRadio, on Google Play Music, and on Spotify. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, which is comicsalternative.com.
That's right. Check out our reviews and comics-related commentary there, and come back every week for our weekly review session.
That's right. And next week, Paul and I are going to be doing our annual Halloween show, which means we're going to look at seasonal Halloween titles as well as recent horror titles. So that's always fun.
Yeah, join us for that.
So until next week, I'm Derek.
And I'm Paul, and have a great week.
Hey, what happened?